Welcome everyone to the second analysis of Ginastera's guitar sonata. In this video I will be analyzing the second movement called Scherzo. If you haven't watched the first episode, I will leave a link in the description below, and I also will leave a link at the very end of this video. Let's get to it. The second movement, called Scherzo, which means joke, is completely different to the opening movement. The overall form is slow, fast, slow, fast. In this case, the second movement is very energetic, upbeat, and with a childish/quirky character, full of dissonances, contemporary techniques, meter changes, and more. In this video, I will be analyzing form, technical aspects, harmony and melody, dynamics, and rhythmic elements. Shall we? This movement consists of 5 pages. The entire movement keeps a steady and fast tempo, and it only changes at the very end, in the last page. As seen in the previous movement, there is a back and forth in terms of tempo change, and this helps in generating contrast within the movement. I am not going to analyze each page of the movement individually in terms of form, but I will pinpoint sections that I see as little returns to an original idea. These returns remind me of a rondeau, in which there is a main theme that is always returned to. It is obviously not the same, but it kind of reminds me of that. These returns, or original ideas, sometimes appear in terms of a specific contemporary technique, also as arpeggios, or simply as a melodic line. I'll exemplify. In terms of percussive characteristics, we have techniques such as scratching the strings at the headstock, and also tapping on the body of the guitar. These appear at different sections of this movement and within their own context. But they still serve the same purpose, to generate a little break. I find this glissandi of chords as another variation of this idea. I know that the composer has written very specific chords in these 2 bars, but I believe they were written this way only due to a lack of better notation. Remember, this piece is from 1976, more than 40 years ago. Amazing. The way I hear it, this is simply holding a hand position and sliding it down the fingerboard following the defined ternary rhythm. Given the speed and tempo of the piece, I presume the intention of the composer was not for the listener to hear each note of each chord crystal clear, but simply hear an idea of a chord sliding down the fingerboard. So instead of playing it this way, I hear it more like this. If you only focus on accenting beats 1 and 4, then you get that same kind of break concept. Another interesting idea I see the composer usually returns to is this series of rasguados, or rasgueados, if you want to call them that way. These show up at different permutations throughout the piece. The concept is to combine some intervals with the open strings of the guitar. For instance, in the first time this concept appears, the open strings used are B and E, or second and first, and the second time he uses open strings D and G, or fourth and third. We also have some nice slides both with single notes or intervals such as this, and also these little harmonics appearances. As you can see, all of these little ideas have a different rhythmic value when compared to the 6/8. This change in rhythmic values helps define a phrase and create a little break in the listener. Fast forwarding to the last page, here the composer directly introduces a tempo change that gives freedom to the performer and creates a new subcolor within the movement. The change is drastic, especially because the tempo is now free and the tonality, if you want to call it that way, sounds more defined. In this new little chapter, the piece uses the G major scale notes, all natural notes and an added F sharp. This section does not sound as a G major, but I wanted to point out it has a more identifiable sound when compared to the randomness of the previous pages. After this, it goes back to the original tempo and dissonance governing idea. This combines previously discussed ideas and percussive/contemporary techniques found in the classical guitar. Another little break is employed by diving once again into a free-tempo little chapter that allows the performer to take its own time and breathe, especially with the ethereal tone the open harmonics bring in. To finish the movement, Ginastera goes back to the original tempo and employs already used techniques, or colors. If you see this page as an analogy to a symphony, then we have 5 distinct movements. They are obviously not movements. So we have fast, slow, fast, slow, fast. If we want to analyze the movement symmetrically, I can see that at the middle of the third page, or halfway through the piece, we have a very important break, very contemporary and with very little use of pitched notes. This certainly differs from the previous phrases, which were mainly atonal, but it will have the same effect on the listener, a break. After this break, which encompasses quite a substantial amount of bars, it then returns to the atonal color and further develops and varies his musical ideas. To recap this section, the composer sticks, mainly, to the ternary rhythm of the movement and ends phrases by slightly shifting away from this rhythm by employing different types of ideas. He goes back, or returns, to a concept that he designs and further develops. Examples of these are employment of contemporary techniques, long notes with glissandi, rasgueados, harmonics, and more. Each phrase has its own personality and meaning within the piece, and Ginastera uses different ways of ending each of them in order to avoid monotony. Towards the end of the movement, the phrasing comes defined by a change in tempo and color. If we draw an analogy with larger works, then we would have a fast, slow, fast, slow, fast movement form. Of course, this is not identical, but I see it as some sort of reference to old, big, large ensemble works. I would say, from personal experience, that this is the most challenging movement of the entire sonata, mainly because it combines a fast tempo with melodic lines across the entire fingerboard. It also requires the performer to make big jumps from, to name an example, position number 9 to the open position 1. In addition to that, the composer also shifts between rhythmic figures and also changes the time signatures. This requires the performer to adapt to these changes and not simply think in 6/8 throughout the entire movement. Let's focus on specific techniques and peculiarities to have in mind if you are also interested in writing guitar music. So if you see the very first chord, if you want to call it that way, there is an important thing to point out. I know many composers write their music having a piano at hand and simply fiddling around and looking for interesting shapes, designs, and more. But this very first cluster is not as easy to achieve as it may be on a piano. If you see each note, then we have a chromatic line of D sharp, E, F. Now, on the piano, that might be very easily achievable as they are all adjacent keys. In the guitar, this is not that easy, as each note has to be assigned to a different string. Given the tuning system of the guitar, this is quite tricky, and you will necessarily have to avail of open strings. In the first iteration of the appearance of the cluster, it will be the first string, or high E. And in the second iteration of this cluster, it will be with the third string, or G. Just a thing to have in mind. I find it interesting that the editor slightly detaches this melodic line from the accompaniment, but I am pretty sure it was to make the piece easier to read. They are to be executed together, but they were written slightly apart to differentiate melody from accompaniment. On the fourth system, we have some quite challenging couple of bars. These bars require, as mentioned previously, the performer to make a big jump. If you see the footnote, it basically tells the performer that once this E is executed, the right hand should shift towards the headstock. So we have to actually move the right hand while executing the slurs E, D, C sharp. This way. The person in charge of the fingering is very specific and knows that including open strings will help the performer execute the piece with better precision. In these bars, we can see how he incorporates open strings so that the position changes are more natural and prevent unwanted noises. So for instance, on System 5, we can see a bar where we have 3 octaves of the same note E. This implies a big jump in the guitar and the use of open strings. So we will have to play the exact same very note in different strings. You might think, so what? Well, each string has a different tension and gauge. So if we want the arpeggio to sound clean and seamless, then we will have to be aware that each string requires a different amount of strength when being executed. This difference in strength is very minute and is not to be taken for granted. So we have to apply different strengths to different strings while executing an arpeggio across 3 octaves at a really fast tempo. Not easy, my friend.
Not easy.
In the second page, we have these rasgueados that combine open strings with intervals. If we follow the score and indications, then we see that this should be executed with alternate right-hand fingerings. However, I am not sure if this is 100% right. Let me explain. If we follow the score, then we would have down, up, down, up, down, up. But this feels quite unnatural if we want to emphasize the 6/8 ternary rhythm. I usually find it better if we accentuate this with 2 downstrokes. So I would do it this way. Down, up, down, down, up, down. The double downstroke seems more natural to correctly emphasize the 6/8 pulse. That is simply how I feel about it. Here we have a very interesting use of the tambora effect on the third system. In this case, we combine the use of the thumb and eye finger while also damping strings. This is how it sounds. After this, we have a series of glissandi that initially start on single pitches and then evolves onto intervals. Something to point out in these 2 bars is that even though at the end of each we have open strings, these are more as a referential thing and not to be actually played. It is a somewhat indication that the notes should be slid towards the end of the fingerboard at the headstock. The indications are self-explanatory, but something to note is that each of these arrows indicate that the performer should slide up or down, and it is written in a way that there are no big gaps in the sound, especially on the transition where we go from this F sharp to the interval. I wanted to focus on this particular harmonic here. This symbol means that the harmonic should sound an octave above of what is written. Now, most of the times, composers use the natural open string harmonics found in the guitar, but in some cases, like this, it requires of an artificially produced harmonic. So the way to do this is to position the left hand finger on the fingerboard and then, with the right hand finger, generate an artificial harmonic exactly 12 frets above.
What?
I'll explain. So we have this D, and we need to play another D which is 12 frets up. But this guitar doesn't have fret number 22. So what to do? Easy. Position the hand and now start looking for the harmonic by ear. Once you get a crystalline and resonating sound, then now you know you have the correct harmonic. Then, simply take a Sharpie and make a little marking on the nylon string. you'll be sure to hit the exact spot where the harmonic is. Moving on to the third page, we see the composer wants to use the percussive capabilities of the guitar by tapping on different parts of either the body or the top. And then we arrive to this little interesting section. So if you look at the indications on the preface and we look for this symbol, it says that the performer should slide this chord up the fingerboard towards an indeterminate chord, as high as possible on the instrument, like this. The next bar is simply an impromptu passage. Simply gives freedom to the performer to improvise, but within the first, second and third string. There are two things I am not getting here. It says sul ponticello, but also near the sound hole. So how would that be achieved? And another thing I am clueless about is this line here. Anyway, this kind of sounds like this. To finish the page, we have a very common type of pizzicato found on Bartók's music, the so-called Bartók pizz. I wish this was for pizza. This pizzicato tells the performer to pull the string opposite to the fingerboard and let it snap against it, just like this. You get a very violent and punchy type of sound effect. I like it. A thing to note in the next page is the apparition of this quarter tone bend vibrato. This is to be executed with precision and an accented feel. Another way of expressing a quarter tone alterations in music is by taking into consideration microtonal music notation. This specific type of music takes into consideration a wider range of tones and pitches. So instead of simply using notes in either semitones or full tones, it also considers notes which are a quarter tone apart, an eighth tone apart, and more. In this system, a quarter tone is written this way. It looks like an ordinary sharp symbol, but with one less line. This music is very specific, and if somebody hears it for the first time, they will probably say, "I know everything about music, and that is out of tune." Because yes, everybody is an expert in music nowadays. We have another apparition of harmonics. I won't develop here, but you can see how the performer needs to combine open strings and artificially produced harmonics. As a general rule, if you see a left hand fingering near this little rhombus, which is the notation for a harmonic, then you know you'll have to create it artificially. In the last page, we have this notation for what I understand as some type of trill. So basically, you need to alternate between the given notes, but with an improvised and random feel. As you can see, each note should be played in a different string, and with a different finger. At the very end of the page, we have a combination of palm hand tambora, Bartók pizzicato, and normal pizzicatos. A nice way of adding different tones and colors to a simple line. To recap this section, this is the most challenging movement of the whole sonata. The composer shows off his most creative powers in terms of contemporary techniques. He utilizes extended techniques that involve the use of guitar parts other than the fingerboard. We see the employment of microtonal music elements such as quarter tones. And we also see the incorporation of the Bartók pizzicato, rasgueados, artificial and natural harmonics, and more. A very quirky movement that will push the performer's technical skills for sure. Amazing! In the first video, I pointed out how this piece does not have a tonal center, so I will jump straight into analyzing harmonic idioms and melodic lines found within this movement. Let's go! So in the first two bars we have, as explained before, a chromatic cluster made up of D sharp, E, and F. On the third bar, this same cluster begins on a G. An interval of a G to D sharp is an augmented fifth. From a sonic point of view, an augmented fifth sounds exactly the same as a minor sixth, given the intervallic relation of the notes. If the original D sharp would have been written as an E flat, which is the enharmonic value of D sharp, then the interval G, E flat, is indeed a minor sixth. But changing this note would definitely make the score more difficult to read, as there would have been too many accidentals in a single bar. I find this harmonic very interesting, and I want to point out, from a technical point of view, that this natural harmonic at the fret 9 is not easily achievable. Although it is a natural open string harmonic, it is not as easy to produce when compared to the harmonics in frets 5, 7, and 12. So in order to produce it with clarity, the plucking hand should be close to the bridge, as indicated on the score. Like this. In the next bars we have a little melody and accompaniment section where the melody is carried on the lower frequencies of the guitar. Here, the 6th string carries the melody while the open string A supports with the accompaniment. I like how the first note of each bar follows a descending chromatic line. So if we analyze this, then we can see a G sharp that falls to a G natural and then resolves onto an F sharp on the subsequent bar. Here, the composer uses 3 ideas already employed in the previous movement. The first is the transposition of a chord, in this case from the 2nd fret to the 8th fret. The second idea is the use of a tritone, an intervallic relation seen many times in the first movement and explained in the first video. And the last idea is the employment of this double major 7th chord. The next bars don't seem, in my opinion, relatable to other concepts already used by the composer. The only thing I'd like to point out is the jump of a major 7th if we take into consideration the strongest beats of the 6-8 bar. These are F to E. After the already explained headstock scratches, we have an interesting run. It begins with a shape already used before, but he now adds a nice chromatic descending line of B, B flat, A. In the next bars, I found the following peculiarities. If I take into consideration the first note of each triplet, then I have all perfect fourths. We have A flat to E flat, then E flat to B flat, and then B flat to F. All perfect fourths. The following might be too stilted, but this is what I found. Maybe I am completely wrong. So I see the use of the modes. The first is the use of the Phrygian mode, but instead of starting on B, it starts on F. This run employs all the notes corresponding to the Phrygian mode, but starting on F rather than B. And then, towards the end of the phrase, it shifts towards the Dorian mode. It might be too picky and overly researched, but this is something I could find in this run. The run ends up on very interesting arpeggios. If I analyze them from a strict point of view, then I have this alternation of an A major chord, which is A, C sharp, E, to an A minor chord, A, C natural, E, only in the space of a single bar, and it is then followed by the apparition of this E at different octaves, +3 to be specific. I find it interesting how every time the composer goes back to this alternating A chord, it adds a new chord in between the A and the E octaves. I'll develop. So the first time, as explained before, we have A and E. Then we can see the apparition of this B major with an added major second, having B, D sharp, F sharp, and C sharp, and then we have the E octaves. On the third iteration of this concept, we have A, then the B chord just explained, then we add a new bar with these major sevenths, in terms of semitones, and dissonant intervals. We have C sharp, C, and F sharp or G flat, G, and then the E octaves. So every time the return appears, a new bar is added in between. We follow with a transposition of perfect fourths that have as accompaniment more perfect fourths in the format of open strings. So we have all of these perfect fourths highlighted in green, and then the accompaniment is always these other perfect fourths highlighted in purple. A thing to note. I know in this bar it is written an augmented third, which is F to A sharp. But from an intervallic point of view, the relation is still a perfect fourth. If we change this A sharp for its enharmonic value B flat, then we have the perfect fourths. But having that B flat would imply having a lot of accidentals within the same bar, and that is not practical at all. This is how the bar would look if using the enharmonic value B flat. Ugh. It is totally confusing and unnecessary. Analyzing this glissandi, I find the following intervallic relation. Let's see if we can find a subliminal message or is it just random intervals. So we have C sharp to C, which is a diminished octave, then we have C down to A, which is a minor third. After that we have A to B flat, compound minor second. We continue with B flat to B natural, or augmented octave. This is followed by B natural down to G sharp, which is a compound minor third. Second last we have G sharp down to G natural, which is a diminished octave. And finally we have G natural down to F sharp, which is a compound minor second. So we have intervallic relations of octave, third, second, octave, third, octave, second. Do we find any specific pattern here? This single notes glissandi then turns into double stops glissandi. These employ all major thirds. We have B, D sharp, and then F, A, with a jump of a tritone. A tritone? Where? Here, when we go from B to F. On the second iteration, the composer transposes this idea down a perfect fourth. Here, we repeat the same idea. Major intervals of F sharp and A sharp, and then C and D, with an interval of a tritone. In this case, from F sharp to C. I mentioned this particular tritone intervallic relation because, as seen in the previous video, it shows up many times disguised within the melodic lines. And the same happens in this very movement. Continuing with this piece, I wanted to take a brief moment to analyze this tritone concept that shows up in the following passage. Let's analyze each of these arpeggios. So the very first note is the same for all of them. Open 4th string, which is a D. Great for resonant purposes. But now let's analyze the second note of each of these arpeggios. So we have B, A, G, F, tritone number 1. Then we have E, D, C, B flat, tritone number 2. Finally we have A, G, F, E flat, tritone number 3. If I analyze the third note of each arpeggio, then I find there is always an ascending semitone. So we have C to D flat, B flat to B, A flat to A, G to A flat, F to F sharp, and then E flat to E. Interesting. This is followed by a series of ascending arpeggios. If we deconstruct, yes, I know that is a very trendy word nowadays, so I use it. Each grouping of 3 notes, then these are the chords found. We have F diminished. Okay, I am cheating a little bit here, because this B should be C flat in order to technically be F diminished. But from a sound point of view, it still is an F diminished. Then this is followed by G minor. Next we have an A major, which is followed by a D sharp 7th with a missing 5th. And in the last 2 bars I find G sharp diminished, B flat minor, C major, and D sharp diminished. I'm not really finding any particular harmonic progression here if I have to be honest. Then we have a series of transpositions of a shape that contain a minor interval and an upper one-tone auxiliary notes. A thing I can see here is that in the first iteration we have a bass line that goes A flat, G, A natural, A flat, so we have a half tone down, one tone up, half tone down. If we analyze the second iteration, then the bass line does B flat, B natural, A, B flat. So now we have half tone up, one tone down, and half tone up. Basically, it is mirroring the bass line. If we analyze the following notes of the next 4 bars, we simply find a transposition of the initial cluster a half tone up. So now we start in E rather than D sharp. And we now have E, F, G flat, each note a semitone apart. or basically a chromatic ascending line. As it does not start on the E, it might be tricky to identify. But if I group them this way, you can see the ascending chromatic line. Funny enough, in the following two bars, it does go back to the initial cluster. Now we can see the use of D sharp, E, F, but again, in a different order and not starting with D sharp. In the next two bars, he transposes the little cluster half tone up. So we now have E sharp, F sharp, G. 3 semitones, and not starting on E sharp, but rather on F sharp. In the next bar, it seems like he's going to repeat this idea and transpose the cluster. He actually does transpose it by now having F sharp, G, A flat. But it doesn't repeat, he simply develops some sort of weird scale that I have to be honest, I couldn't find any specific tangible pattern as found clearly in employment of the cluster. Maybe you can give me a hand. If I want to be stilted, then I can see sporadic appearances of this cluster idea. For instance, here we have G, G sharp, A, here we have G sharp, A, B flat, and here G, G sharp, A. Am I overthinking it? What I do find in the next bars, it is actually that same idea of the repetition of the cluster. Now we have it in the notes A sharp, B and C, but starting on B. If I group them this way, it will be clearer. In this last bar, before the descending arpeggio, he develops on this cluster with employment of a lower and upper auxiliary notes. The descending arpeggios are chords already used in the previous page. Here we can identify D sharp diminished, F diminished, G major, and this is a new one, which I am cheating here and saying it is a B flat diminished. I'll develop a little bit here. B flat diminished is made up of B flat, D flat, F flat, but if I am a bit cheeky here, then I can enharmonically renotate this E to F flat and voila! B flat diminished. After the percussive section of the movement, we have this sliding chord that was found previously in page 2. It is simply a combination of 3 perfect fourths. We have G sharp and C sharp, then C sharp and F sharp, and then F sharp and B. Very nice. I am not too sure if there is any particular pattern followed in the use of this glissandi. The only thing I was able to find is that he uses an augmented fourth, a perfect fourth, and then a diminished fifth. From a sound point of view, an augmented fourth sounds the same as a diminished fifth. I am only speaking from an intervallic relation point of view. The notes used are completely different. In the next page I find something super interesting and that I have just realized. Ginastera uses the concept of the cluster once again to create a very interesting melodic line. Let's analyze each one and see. So, as explained before, the cluster used in the first page was D sharp, E, F. Basically, a chromatic ascending line. Now, let's start. Cluster 1. G flat, G, A flat. Check. Cluster 2. A sharp, B. Check. Cluster 3. C, C sharp, D. Check. Cluster 4. E flat, E, F. Check. Cluster 5. E, F, F sharp. Check. Cluster 6. D flat, D, E flat. Check. Cluster 7. B flat, B, C. Check. And cluster 8. G, A flat, A. Check. This is really interesting. I never realized about this before. This is followed by an array of rasgueados. This intention has already appeared before, but now the composer uses some kind of imitation as the relation between the notes is not exactly the same. Now it uses different open strings. In this case, Ginastera chose to use open strings D and G, and also G and B. What comes next is quite interesting. We have a series of ascending major sevenths, if we're speaking from a sonic point of view, because we would need to apply some enharmonic values. If we skip the opening resonant chord, then we have the following. G flat F, then we have A flat or G sharp and A, follows a C and a B, then E flat and D, then A flat and G, then B and B flat or A sharp, then D and C sharp, then E and the F, then B flat and A, then C sharp, D, followed by D sharp and E, and finally F sharp and G. If we take that final G as a connecting point with what comes next, can you figure out what this will be? Ding 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 ding! The cluster one more time. Now we have the ascending chromatic line F sharp, G, A flat. It is funny because if you don't analyze the piece like this, you might think they are just random notes. But subliminally, they are all connected through this idea of a cluster and how the composer transposes it in very unique ways. Moving on, we can find another permutation of this idea, in this case with A, B flat, C flat, all semitones, and then, maybe to break up a little bit this idea, he dives into these chromatically ascending major thirds. These are A flat C, then A natural C sharp, followed by B flat D, then B natural D sharp, then the commonly used C, E, and finally D flat F. At the beginning of the harmonics, we can see he actually continues with the major thirds. So we have now another major third between D and F sharp, but then he further develops with a different set of intervals. If we just focus on the upper note of the interval, then we see the chromatically ascending line clearly. C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp. The same principle applies to the lower note of the interval. Guess what? More clusters! Yay! Look, B flat, B natural, C. This is then followed by D flat, D natural, E flat. We continue with E, F, F sharp, then G, G sharp, A, then, thank God, he further develops with a new, different color. I can find mainly perfect fourths and perfect fifths. Am I being too picky? C, G, perfect fourth, C sharp, F sharp, perfect fourth, E, B, perfect fourth, F, B flat, perfect fifth, A flat, E flat, perfect fifth, A, D, perfect fourth. So it seems that on the second bar he's going to use 3 sets of perfect fifths, but on the last iteration he uses a perfect fourth rather than a perfect fifth. The beginning of the subsequent harmonics still continue with this principle of perfect fourths, but then develops, I believe, 3. Almost there. We follow with another variation of the opening cluster. Now we have the use of C sharp, D, E flat, and then A sharp, B, C. This is followed by a series of big interval leaps and a pseudo-transposition of this idea. He moves this shape up 1 fret, but on the second iteration he doesn't use the open B string, but rather the open G string. Mistake? Intention? Who knows? The beginning of the last page starts with a return to the opening cluster D sharp, E and F, and then simply jumps around the fingerboard. So now we go to A sharp, B, C, then F sharp, G, A flat, and then C sharp, D, E flat. He does jump in perfect fourths though. Then we have another variation of ascending major sevenths, a little imitation to what we've seen in the previous page. So now we have C, B, then E, E flat, or D sharp, then we continue with A flat, G, then D, C sharp, followed by B flat, A, and then F sharp, F. In the following passage of glissandi, I wasn't able to find out much more than the intervallic relation between the last note of the glissandi and the trills. I found there is a compound minor second between these, basically a semitone. So I have C sharp that lands on D, these are compound, but I am just analyzing them in absolute terms. Then we have B flat and B, and then A flat and A. And finally, If we want to be picky, I can see there is an F natural and an E on the open string harmonics at the 12th fret. The next section simply employs the G major scale mostly, but not only, via the use of the open harmonics at the 12th fret. If you take a look, this section uses all natural notes with the addition of an accidental on the F, hence the G major scale. However, it does not sound as if you were playing in G major, but it certainly has way more stability than all the clusters and major 7s seen before. It does, interestingly enough, finish on a G. After this section, that certainly comes in like a breath of fresh air, the composer goes back to the idea of the cluster. This might be overthought, but is it possible we have an employment of a double cluster? I can see a cluster on G, A flat, A, and also a second cluster on A flat, A, B flat. Do you agree? This is followed by a series of ascending arpeggios that share one thing in common, a major 7th, always in terms of semitones. So we have C and B, then E, D flat, then we have A flat, G, and finally F sharp, F. The second last section goes back to the idea of the open harmonics. This time, the composer gives freedom to the performer and simply fiddles around all the natural harmonics found within the 4th fret of the guitar. I see it as a simple transposition of an idea, from the 12th fret to the 4th fret of the guitar. To finish the movement, the composer uses the diatonic scale employing all unaltered notes and following a simple melodic line from A down to E. He adds some specific techniques discussed in the previous section to add some extra flavor and make it more interesting. If I want to be a little bit picky here, the movement ends on a note which is also present on the opening cluster, E. Note: the first movement also uses this same note both in the opening and closing chord. To recap this section, we can clearly see that the composer has a musical beacon, a cluster of 3 adjacent semitones. He takes this concept and deconstructs it and presents it in different styles, sometimes as a melodic scale, sometimes as a cluster, within arpeggios, and more. As there is no specific tonal center, he uses, every so often, an array of chord progressions that help go back and forth to section within the piece. Another way he breaks the frequent use of the cluster is by having ascending and descending leaps of major 7s, and also transposing ideas across the fingerboard. This chapter ends up on the diatonic scale that gives a more stable color to the movement, especially given the atonal characteristics found within the entire movement. The dynamics found within this movement are super varied and really add to the personality of the piece. The first page of the movement mostly revolves around quiet and soft passages, with one exception. As mentioned previously, this piece is quite quirky and playful, and the initial double piano dynamic adds a nice mysterious tone to it. If we highlight the soft passages in the first page, we can see they account for most of it. We have a substantial amount of bars played super soft, then a little change to piano that grows into a mezzo forte, and then back to the piano section. I like using colors to highlight the different sections, as you probably know by now. It is interesting to see how Ginastera adds colors by indicating the performer to move its hand gradually. He did the same on the previous movement, but in this case you can see how, as a performer, you have to move from the natural position towards the bridge, then back to the natural position, then towards the fingerboard, and then back to the natural position. The introduction of rasgueados comes with a new dynamic marking, forte. However, the composer seems like he's playing with the listener, as he almost immediately switches back to piano and goes back to that mysterious tone. To break the piece, and with the introduction of a new technique, the glissandi, Ginastera switches to a forte section, so he creates a change in the listener utilizing both a new technique and a new dynamic marking. However, he changes them quite often, as you can see how in the space of 3 bars he switches between 3 dynamic markings. See how the composer adds this diminuendo marking at the beginning of the bar so that, by the end of the whole passage, the performer should be playing at a very soft volume. Sometimes it is better to add this little indication here, rather than incorporating this kind of symbol across, in this case, a whole system. The same principle is applied in the subsequent passage, but inverted. So now, we performers need to go from pianissimo towards fortissimo. Again, it's better to add a crescendo indication here, rather than swapping the score with unnecessary marking across many bars. By the way, this jump from the upper register of the guitar towards the third position is almost impossible to achieve while maintaining the tempo, so it is the performer's duty to find a way to make it as smooth as possible. When the composer returns to the already explained clusters idea, he focuses on a dynamic that he only changes once he's going to further develop such idea. What I mean here is that he starts changing the dynamics once he slowly starts drifting away from the clusters idea. Yet, it always revolves around the louder range of the guitar. I find it interesting how he assigns different dynamics to this double voicing use of the guitar. So what I mean is that he uses a set of dynamics for when the guitar is used from a percussive point of view, and he uses a different set of dynamics for when he uses the guitar from a traditional point of view. Sometimes they are similar, and sometimes they are completely different. See how when these glissandi reappear, the composer uses again the forte dynamics. Looks like he decided to always use the louder range of the guitar for this technique. Probably to enhance their effect and for the slide to be correctly heard by the listener. If this was played softly, maybe the intention wouldn't be so clear and prominent. We follow with a little melodic run that increases its volume as it goes up, and then decreases its volume as it goes down, standard. In this reiteration of the rasgueados, the composer goes back to a soft dynamic. Just like the glissandi, it seems that he chose to use a soft dynamic for this passage and stick to it, probably to consistently keep that mysterious and somber tone throughout the piece. One difference I could find is that in the first iteration he chose to add a diminuendo indication, while here he chooses a crescendo. I find it interesting how he creates a build-up, which lands on this open chord but then, immediately after, goes back to a piano dynamic. It is almost as if it was messing with the listener's expectations. See how he goes from piano to forte, then takes a step back and then repeats this idea. In the second iteration, he starts on a mezzo forte but goes all the way up to a double forte marking. He follows with a descending dynamic range intention, in this case from sforzato down to forte, then towards mezzo forte and finally to piano. Here he uses that same concept explained seconds ago, but a bit different. In this case, he goes from piano to forte, just as before, but in the second phrase, instead of going up to mezzo forte, he goes down to double piano. The return to the clusters sees Ginastera utilizing a soft dynamic. This is quite tricky, because the tambour effect has to be played precisely and the natural reaction is to give it a blast, given the percussive nature of this technique. So it is almost as if this was going against the grain. Also, I believe that the dissonant nature of these clusters go well with this type of dynamic. It really adds a somber and mysterious tone to the movement. As guessed before, the glissandi reiterate towards the end of the movement and with a forte dynamic, again, and this is my opinion, in order not to lose the special effect of sliding a finger down or up a string. See how, for the very contrasting sections of harmonics, he uses the same dynamic, pianissimo. This really contributes to creating a contrast within the movement, especially given the ethereal nature of the harmonics and their resonant characteristics. In between these, we can see a return to a forte dynamic, a refrain. To end up the piece, he goes back, after the harmonics, to a super forte, violent and aggressive passage that dies within the space of 2 bars. See how we go from super forte to super piano in the space of 4 bars. Interestingly enough, he ends the movement on the same dynamic marking that opened it, double piano. To recap this section, we can see the composer has a wide array of dynamics. These seem, at times, erratic and random, sudden and unexpected, and intentionally unnatural. The composer definitely plays with expectation and does not allow the listener to anticipate to the music, a great way to achieve engagement throughout. He does stick to specific dynamics to specific sections, as seen on the glissandi and the harmonic sections towards the end of the piece. The playful and quirky character of the piece is greatly enhanced with the use of such a varied array of dynamics. Definitely a challenging movement on the performer's ability to achieve intriguing colors and tones. I will jump straight into analyzing the rhythmic characteristics of this movement. This one has a very strong 6-8 time signature and really serves as an anchor while giving a pulse quite easy to follow. The degree in which the listener will be able to identify the beat will rely on the performer's execution. As seen in the little preface, the composer indicates that the ternary rhythmic pulse must be maintained throughout. Most of the movement is in quavers, or eighth notes. In the very first page, there is a little break when the composer resorts to two simultaneous changes. The first is by shifting from quavers to dotted crotchets, and the second is by shifting from the traditional use of the guitar to a more percussive use of it, by scratching the strings at the headstock. If we move on to the second page, we can see how the piece still continues, mostly, in quavers. The composer usually shifts between techniques in order to create contrast and variety. As an example, in this page we can see how he uses rasgueados, glissandi, arpeggios, and more. Just as he did in the first page, here we can see he creates a little break by changing both rhythmic figure to dotted crotchet and technique to glissando. A very interesting thing to point out is how he employs melody and accompaniment in this little arpeggios section. Let me explain. The rhythm is still in 6-8, but see how he places the descending melodic line on the second quaver of each triplet rather than on the first one. This generates a very interesting syncopation as the melodic line is always on the weaker beat of the ternary rhythm. It is a big challenge on the performer as he or she will be required to maintain the beats while emphasizing this interesting melodic line. Towards the end of the page, we have a very interesting ear-bending passage. As explained before, he utilizes clusters across the fingerboard. This one is made up of E, F, and G flat. In this case, instead of starting on the first note of the cluster, or E, he starts on the second one, F. So he goes up to G flat and then down to E. We can see Ginastera shifted the cluster by 2 quavers. Highlighting it this way will make it easier for you to identify. This creates some sort of mind twist on the ear as one would expect the first note of the cluster to match with the first note of the pulse, but it doesn't. Sneaky. If we move on to the next cluster, he does something also very interesting. As seen on bar 2, he moves the cluster and now employs the notes D sharp, E, and F. However, this time it starts on the third note, F. Yet, he adds another trick. There is no pattern that simply repeats across the bar line. Now he chose to use a 4-note pattern on a 3-note cluster. In the next 2 bars, Ginastera continues with the concept of not starting on the first note of the cluster, in this case E sharp, but rather on the second one, F sharp. However, he does stick to a pattern that repeats. It goes down and then up. If I compare it to the very first apparition of this, we have some sort of inversion. The first time he went up and then down, and now he goes down and then up, but both times starting on the second note of the cluster, which are just 1 semitone apart. I won't analyze exhaustively all the rest of the bars, but I will pinpoint the apparition of a hemiola on the 4th bar of the 3rd system. Ginastera matches a 2-note pattern against a ternary rhythm such as the 6-8. So the first note of the pattern will go against the natural feel of the pulse. See how we have a 1-2, 1-2, 1-2 pattern placed against a 1-2-3-4-5-6 pulse. So the feel goes from 3 to 2. However, the addition of a slur on the 1st and 4th beat is also intentional. as naturally the performer would be tempted to slur from B to C, and not as indicated. Tricky Ginastera. What follows is pretty much standard in terms of rhythm, except for the introduction of a polyrhythm of 5 against 4. This means that the performer should play 5 semiquavers in the space of 4 semiquavers, or 2 quavers. Usually, the best way to correctly subdivide a quintuplet is simply by spelling out the word hippopotamus, while clapping on the first syllable. The problem here is that the composer chooses to place a 5-4 polyrhythm on top of a 6-8 ternary rhythm. So I think the best way to practice this rhythm would be to clap 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for a couple of times, and then, when this comes natural, simply add the word hippopotamus in between claps 4 and 5. A very natural thing to do is to land the last syllable of the word on the 6th clap, but that means you're playing it wrong. It would have to land just a notch before the clap. At the very end of the page, he shifts between 6-8 and a 9-8 rhythm. I can presume he did this so that the Bartók beats would land on the first beat of the subsequent 6-8 bar, and the performer can simply count one bar before continuing with the piece. The fourth page displays a different array of rhythmic intricacies. On the fourth system, we can see another use of a 2-note pattern against a 3-note pulse. See how the beams extend across the bar lines? These are simply for the performer to understand how the notes are to be phrased. When we reach the quarter tone vibratos, we see the composer simply takes the last 3 beats and plays around with them. So the initial idea is made of this line. The second time, this idea is repeated, but a dotted minim is trimmed off. Now we only have one. For the third instance, the composer changes the last dotted minim into a dotted crotchet. The seventh system features more hemiolas. In the first 2 bars, these are disguised by the phrasing. This is because the guitar is playing ascending major thirds. On the third and fourth bar, this is more evident, as seen on the rhythmic figure utilized, crotchets. Towards the end of the page, another polyrhythm can be found, in this case across 2 full bars. I am not very sure this should be considered as a 5 against 3. I would deconstruct this by simply counting on 4 and then placing the word hippopotamus on top of it, just as explained before. One last thing worth mentioning related to this page, which also appears on the next one, is this implicit accent on the third beat of each of the 3-note groups. As mentioned previously, a 6-8 bar has strong beats on the first and fourth quaver. However, the composer places this little arpeggio symbol on the third and sixth, a good way to keep the steady pulse while adding a little accent that goes against the natural feel of the time signature. A thing worth considering. In these 2 sections, the composer uses, technically, very short notes, demi-semi-quavers. Demi-semi what? They are 30-second notes. However, this should be played without a tempo, as indicated on the score. It is interesting to see how the composer shifts between 6-note groups, 5-note groups, and 4-note groups. On the second last return to the original tempo, we see a very interesting thing called a polymeter. We can see a 4-note pattern placed against a 6-note pulse. If I group the notes this way, we can clearly see how this works. However, and in order not to change time signature unnecessarily, it is easier to write them within the already defined ternary rhythm. Once we reach the headstock scratches, we see a combination of 3 different rhythmic groupings. The first goes in line with the current time signature. The second places a 2-note group against the ternary rhythm, and the last one uses a 4-note group against the pulse. See how the first iteration matches first and fourth strong beats of the bar. The second iteration sees the first, third and fifth beats accented, rather than first and fourth. And finally, in the last iteration, we have the accents on the beats 1, 5, 3. This is how it sounds. 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6. The first bar of the last system sees a sporadic 1-bar time signature change from 6/8 to 7/8. The grouping of notes in this bar should be considered as 2 plus 2 plus 3. There are many ways of grouping notes within a bar. Other examples, to name a few, would be 3 plus 4, 5 plus 2, 2 plus 5, and more. There's no need to analyze the last 3 bars, it's pretty straightforward. To recap the rhythmic section, we can identify a strong Turner rhythm that is maintained throughout the movement. However, the composer adds, every so often, different grouping of notes in order to create accents that go against the natural feel of the 6/8 time signature. The composer uses techniques such as hemiolas, polyrhythms, and polymeters to add new layers of richness. The combination of different grouping of notes add to the character of the piece. There are few sporadic time signature changes before returning to the governing meter. From a performance point of view, the most difficult thing, in terms of rhythm, is to keep up the tempo while seamlessly shifting between the meandering sets of diversely grouped notes. As a wrap-up for the whole second movement, we can see a new, very contrasting chapter within the entire sonata. This movement is fast, quirky, and full of incredible tones and colors. The rhythm is clear and defined, with seldom variations that generate contrast while maintaining an underlying pulse. Towards the end of the movement, there are 2 distinct breaks that completely change the color of it. The difficulty level of this musical episode is advanced, and will surely challenge the performer's technical skills. As always, thanks very much for making it this far, and stay strong during the COVID lockdown number 2. I will begin working on the third movement shortly, but in the meantime you can check the first movement analysis here, or you can subscribe here. Peace!